The depot was already half gone when Dara Osai kicked the door in. Smoke poured out. She did not step back. She pulled her scarf over her nose and went inside, because somewhere in that building there were 3 Yassiri wounded who had not made it to the evacuation shuttle, and nobody else was going in after them. The war had officially ended 41 hours ago. Someone had forgotten to tell the Skithral artillery unit on the ridge. Behind her, Ren Adebio grabbed her arm. "Dara, the structure is failing." "I know," she said. "That was meant to stop you." "I know," she said again, and moved deeper in. The depot was a Yathiri supply facility, 4 arms wide, built for species taller than humans, shelves stacked with containers whose labels she could not read. Fire had eaten the eastern wall. The ceiling groaned. Dara swept her light left and right and found the first wounded soldier slumped against a support beam. A Yathiri male, one arm shattered, breathing but not conscious. She called back to Ren. He came. They moved the soldier to the door. The second was easier, a young Yathiri female, awake, furious, embarrassed to need help. She walked out herself once Dara steadied her. The third was in the sub-basement. Dara found the stairwell by the heat, not the heat of fire, something else. A dry, deep warmth coming up from below, like standing near a forge. She went down. The basement was sealed, dim, and untouched by the fire above. Metal shelving, locked containers, and in the far corner, one Yassiri soldier sitting against the wall with a leg wound, pressing his hands over it, eyes wide when he saw a human walk in. She crossed to him, checked the wound, manageable. And then she noticed the crate. It was about the size of a supply locker, unlocked, its lid slightly open. The heat she had felt from the stairs, it was coming from inside. She looked at the soldier, he looked at the crate. Something in his face moved, not guilt, closer to fear. She opened it. The egg was the size of a large watermelon. It sat in a nest of shredded insulation and heat-retaining mesh. The shell was a deep, layered gold, not metallic, more like the inside of a flame, and it pulsed, slowly, steadily, like something breathing. Dara stared at it. The soldier said something in Yathiri she did not fully catch. The translator clipped to her collar rendered it as, "Leave that." She looked at him, then at the egg, then at the ceiling, which made a sound like a large thing deciding to give up. "Can you walk?" she asked the soldier. He could not. She helped him up and took his weight on her shoulder. She looked at the egg one more time. The pulse was very steady. It was also very warm. Whatever was inside, it was alive. She called up the stairs. "Ren." "What?" "I need you to carry something." "Is it the wounded soldier?" "No, I have him. It's something else." A pause. "How heavy?" "Heavy enough that I can't carry it and him at the same time." Ren appeared at the top of the stairs, looked down at her, looked at the egg in the crate, and said nothing for a full 3 seconds. Then he came down, lifted the egg out of the crate, and his knees bent slightly with the weight, and carried it up without asking a single question. They got out 70 seconds before the east wing of the depot collapsed. Outside, in the smoky half-light of the fringe moon, the evacuation commander looked at the egg in Ren's arms and opened his mouth. "Unidentified biological specimen," Dara said. "Possible medical relevance. It goes in my care under Field Protocol 7. Field Protocol 7 is for living tissue requiring temperature-controlled transport." "Yes," she met his eyes. "It is warm, it is alive, I am not leaving it." The commander looked at her, looked at Ren, who shrugged, looked at the egg, which pulsed once, gently, as if it agreed with her. He signed the manifest. On the shuttle back to forward operating base threshold, Dara sat with the egg in her lap, wrapped in a thermal blanket. The Yathiri soldier she had carried out sat across from her. He stared at the egg for a long time. When she met his eyes and raised an eyebrow, he looked away. Ren, sitting beside her, leaned over and spoke quietly. "The Yathiri didn't put that crate on the manifest." "No," she said. "And the Skithral bombed that depot specifically." "Yes. So whatever is in that egg, is something both sides either wanted very badly or wanted destroyed. She looked down at the gold shell in her lap. The pulse was calm and regular, like a heartbeat, and nobody got either. Ren was quiet for a moment. Then, you know, you just made this extremely complicated. I know. I'm just making sure you know. Ren, she said. Yeah. It was warm, and it was alive, and it was in a burning building. She kept her eyes on the egg. What was I supposed to do? He did not have an answer for that. Neither did she really, but the egg pulsed again in her hands, steady as a clock, and she held it a little tighter as the shuttle lifted away from the fringe and the forgotten war fell away below them. 3 different people tried to take the egg on the first day. The first was a military logistics officer who wanted it catalogued and stored. Dara told him it required constant body heat-adjacent warmth and that she was, as of that morning, the only approved handler. He asked where that approval came from. She said, Field Protocol 7, signed by Commander Addies at 3:40 hours. This was technically accurate. He went away to check the forms. The second was a Yathiri liaison attached to the Sci-Fi committee. She spoke through a translator and called the egg misplaced Dominion property. Dara asked her to provide documentation of its origin. The liaison said the documentation was classified. Dara said she would be happy to release the egg to its documented owner as soon as that documentation was provided. The liaison left and did not come back. The third was a Yathiri biologist sent by someone further up the chain than the liaison. She was quiet, professional, and clearly frightened. She examined the egg for 11 minutes without touching it. Then she wrote a 2-word report on her datapad, showed it to the officer supervising her, and resigned her commission on the spot. Nobody could find her the next morning. General Orvath called Dara into his office on day 2. He was a patient man. He had the particular patience of someone who had spent 20 years watching humans do unexpected things in unexpected places and had learned that arguing rarely helped. He sat across from her and folded his hands on the desk. The Yathiri want it back, he said. I know. They haven't provided documentation of ownership. I know. The Skithril have denied the depot existed. I know that too. He looked at her for a moment. You're not giving it back. Not to either of them, General, not without knowing what it is. He exhaled, not quite a sigh, more like a man measuring his remaining options. I've put in a request to a xenobiology team on Meridian. They'll need to examine it in transit. That's fine, she said. I'll be there. Orvath gave her a look that meant he knew he had already lost this conversation and was deciding how to file the report. You understand this could be a diplomatic situation. Yes, sir. You understand both sides of a war neither of them wants to officially acknowledge are interested in this egg. Yes, sir. And you're still. Yes, sir. He picked up his pen, put it down, dismissed Osai. On the transport vessel Meridian, 4 days out from the fringe, Dara received a message on a personal encrypted channel. The sender identified himself as Archivist Sen, attached to the Yathiri Institute of Historical Record, retired. He was brief and very careful with his words. He said the egg is Oranthos verath. He said the species was not hunted to extinction. He said 300 years ago, the Yathiri High Council declared them extinct for political reasons, altered the record, and drove the surviving population to a location removed from all official charts. He said, I have spent 40 years trying to prove this. He said, please do not let the government know you have received this message. He did not say how he had found her. He did not explain how he knew what the egg was. He signed off with 3 words, keep it safe. Dara read the message twice. Then she went to the medical bay, where the egg sat in a warming unit she had borrowed from the surgical team, and she sat down next to it. She had done some searching of her own in the past 4 days. Oranthos verath appeared in old Yathiri texts. She had found fragments in unrestricted historical archives, badly indexed, partially redacted. The illustrations showed large winged creatures, gold and amber, long-lived, intelligent. The texts described them in language that did not sound like how you described animals. The egg pulsed, slow and warm and steady. On the fifth day, it cracked. There was no warning. One moment it was whole. The next there was a sound like something hard and sharp splitting from the inside, and a fracture line ran from the top of the egg to the bottom in under a second. Dara was on her feet before she had decided to stand. The shell came apart in 4 pieces. What was inside was small, smaller than she expected, given the weight of the egg, and wet and gold, with amber markings along a spine that was still unfolding. It had 4 limbs and wings that were pressed flat against its back, and a head that it lifted immediately, with effort, the way all newborn things lift their heads, seeking. It found her. The eyes were amber, bright, and very much awake. Dara felt something hit her somewhere in the chest that was not quite sound and not quite feeling, more like a door opening in a room she had not known was there. It was not words. It was something older than words. It was recognition. The creature looked at her. She looked at it. She felt from somewhere that was not her own mind. Oh, you. And despite everything, despite the diplomatic mess, the unsigned documentation, the 2 governments, and the unanswered messages and General Orvath's careful patience, she felt something answer from inside herself. Yeah, me. Behind her, Ren spoke from the doorway. He had been standing there for she did not know how long. His voice was very quiet. So, he said, we have a dragon now. Dara did not look away from the gold creature in the warming unit, who was watching her with ancient, alert eyes. Yeah, she said, we do. Nobody had a form for a dragon. This became clear very quickly once the Meridian docked at the human orbital station above Earth. There was a form for xenobiological specimens. There was a form for intelligent alien contacts. There was a form for creatures of unknown classification. None of them had a checkbox that covered gold dragon, bonded to a human medic, growing approximately 8 centimeters a week. Dara filled out all 3 forms anyway and submitted them to 4 different departments. 2 of them bounced back. One was accepted with a note that said, please follow up with documentation of species origin. She wrote back, working on it. Sol, the name, came to her quietly one morning, the way the right word sometimes does, and when she thought it in his direction, he had lifted his head and blinked, so that settled that Sol was given temporary housing in a research facility outside Nairobi, in a building that had previously been used for large mammal veterinary care. The staff adapted quickly. Humans, Dara had noticed, were very good at adapting to things that were supposed to be impossible. Within 2 weeks, the veterinary team had constructed a thermal rest area, established a feeding schedule, and started a betting pool on how large he would get. By month 2, Sol was the size of a draft horse. By month 4, he could fly. The first time he flew, he circled the facility twice, came back, and landed directly in front of Dara, looking extremely pleased with himself. She felt from him the specific satisfaction of something done correctly for the first time. She told him well done. He butted his enormous head gently against her shoulder. The outside world had opinions. The news cycle lasted approximately 18 hours before becoming global. There were protests, small ones, mostly from people worried about ecological impact and land use. There were petitions asking for Sol to be moved offshore to space, to anywhere other than a continent. There were counter-petitions. There was a government task force. There were 7 competing jurisdictions arguing about whether Sol was a wildlife matter, a diplomatic matter, or a defense matter. There was a documentary crew that applied for access and was told no, applied again and was told no, and applied a 3rd time and was told that the answer had not changed. And there was the rest of humanity, which was, broadly, absolutely delighted. Ren, back home in Lagos for 3 weeks of leave, gave one interview, then another. Then he stopped counting. He was charming about it in the way that came naturally to him, honest, slightly funny, never overselling anything. He described carrying the egg out of the depot as less heroic than it sounds, more heavy than you'd think. He described Sol as a very large animal who knows exactly how smart he is and would like you to know that he knows. The phrase, we have a dragon, entered casual human conversation within a month. People used it the way people use phrases when something has shifted permanently and they are still finding words for the shift. Consul Ilrith arrived on a Tuesday. He was Yathiri, tall, pale, four-armed, with the particular posture of someone who had spent decades managing difficult situations and now found himself in one that had no precedent. He was polite. He used the word specimen twice in the first 5 minutes, then noticed Dara's expression and switched to the creature. And then, after Sol walked past the window and looked directly at him with those amber eyes, stopped using either term. "My government," Ilrith said carefully, "has an interest in the situation." "I know," Dara said. "The egg was not on any manifest your government acknowledged," she said, "so I am curious about the nature of this interest." Ilrith was quiet. He had the look of a man who was very aware that he was on the wrong side of several facts. Archivist Sen arrived the next morning, unannounced, carrying 2 bags and 40 years of research in a portable data archive. He was old, smaller than most Yathiri, and moved with the careful speed of someone who had been waiting a very long time to move at all. When he saw Sol, who was in the exterior yard, watching a group of local children who had gathered at the fence, he stopped walking. He stood very still for a moment. Then he said something in Yathiri that the translator rendered as, "There you are." Sol turned his head. He looked at Sen. The bioluminescent markings along his spine, which usually glowed a steady warm gold, shifted briefly, just for a moment, to something deeper, something older. He held the old archivist's gaze for a long time. Then he walked over, lowered his head, and touched his nose gently to Sen's outstretched hand. Sen told Dara the full story that evening, sitting at the facility's small kitchen table with his data archive open between them. He spoke quietly and did not rush. He told her about the political decision made 300 years ago, the altered records, the hidden world, the surviving dragons who had never gone extinct but had simply been made to disappear from official history. Dara listened to all of it. When he finished, she sat with it for a moment. "How many are left?" she asked. "I don't know exactly. Enough, more than anyone in the High Council would want you to know." She looked out the window. Sol was lying in the yard in the last of the evening light, gold scales catching the last red of sunset. She felt from him, faintly, across the distance, something like the feeling of a long breath, waiting, patience that had been inherited from something very old. "Then we need to find them," she said. Sen nodded slowly, like a man who had waited 40 years to hear exactly that sentence. "Yes," he said, "we do." The Galactic Assembly had been meeting in Geneva for 212 years. In that time, it had handled wars, border collapses, first contacts, and one very complicated argument about trade routes that had taken 16 years to resolve. It had never, in all of that time, convened a formal session about a dragon. Until now. The session request was filed by the human delegation, jointly with Archivist Sen, acting under the banner of the Yathiri Institute of Historical Record. The title of the session was Emergency Review Oranthos Verath Species Status and Declaration of Historical Record Integrity. The Yathiri government filed 2 objections before the session date was even set. Both objections were overruled on procedural grounds, which meant the Assembly's Rules Committee had looked at the documentation Sen provided and decided there was enough there to proceed. The Assembly building sat near the lake, wide and old, and full of the specific silence of places where serious things happen. Dara arrived with Sen and Ilrith, who had been very quiet for 3 days. Outside the main entrance, Sol waited. He had grown again. He was now roughly the size of a city bus, which made parking complicated. He folded his wings, sat down on the flagstones of the assembly courtyard, and waited with a patience that made several security officers very nervous. A crowd gathered at the perimeter. Sol watched them watch him, his markings held steady gold. Inside, the session began badly. The Yathiri High Council's representative, a senior diplomat named Ovaris, who had the bearing of someone used to talking until others gave up, opened by questioning the chain of custody of the egg, the legal status of Sol as a being of interest versus property, and the jurisdiction of the human delegation to bring the matter forward at all. Dara waited until he was finished. Then she stood up. She was not a diplomat. She had not been trained to speak in rooms like this. She spoke the way she had always spoken, directly, without decoration, as if she was explaining a patient's chart. An entire species was told not to exist, she said. The record was changed to say they were gone. The survivors were hidden. And when one egg was found, the first response from 2 different governments was to make sure it stayed hidden or got destroyed. She looked around the room. Sol is not property. Sol is a person. He has inherited memory from 300 years of his people hiding in a place that does not appear on any official map. He knows what fear of the Aetheri government smells like. He knew it from birth. She paused. We are asking this assembly to look at that, just to look at it, that's all. The room was quiet. Ovaris began to respond. Ilrith spoke first. Every head turned. Consul Ilrith, representing the Aetheri Dominion, had been silent for the entire session. He was not silent now. He spoke for 6 minutes. He cited the records Sen had compiled. He cited the resignation of the Aetheri biologist who had seen the egg and understood immediately what it was. He cited 3 internal diplomatic communications he had obtained through channels that were, technically, available to him as a consul, but that he had clearly not been expected to use. He concluded by filing a formal dissent against his own government's position on the species status declaration. Ovaris looked at him as if he had set himself on fire. Ilrith sat down and straightened his jacket. Later, outside during the recess, Ren found Ilrith standing near a window that overlooked the courtyard where Sol was waiting. The 2 of them stood in comfortable silence for a moment, which surprised Ren, who had expected it to be uncomfortable. That was your career, Ren said eventually. Ilrith was quiet for a moment. Perhaps, he said, there are people within my government who have been waiting for a moment like this. I am not entirely alone in this position. But you didn't know that for certain when you stood up. Another pause. No. Ren looked at Sol in the courtyard, sitting in the pale Geneva sunlight, enormous and patient. The crowd at the perimeter had grown larger. A child at the front had pressed both hands against the fence railing and was staring with wide, total concentration, the way children do when they see something that rearranges what they thought was possible. Sol looked at the child. Very deliberately, he lowered his head until he was eye level with her and held still. The child did not run. She reached one hand through the fence railing. Sol's bioluminescent markings shifted to something soft and warm, like lamplight. Ren exhaled. You know what the problem is with you lot, he said to Ilrith, not unkindly. You forgot they're real. You made them extinct on paper so many times that you actually forgot. Ilrith watched the child's hand hovering near Sol's jaw. He said nothing. Inside, the vote to open a formal inquiry passed by a margin of 31-14. It was not justice. It was the beginning of the process of something that might eventually become justice. Dara understood the difference. She had worked in field medicine long enough to know that stabilizing a patient was not the same as healing them, but you could not heal them without stabilizing them first. She walked out into the courtyard. Sol lifted his head from the fence and looked at her. She felt from him the particular feeling she had started to recognize over months of learning to read him, the feeling of a door that had been shut for a very long time, opening just slightly. It's a start, she said. He looked at her steadily. She felt him say, without words, is that enough? She sat down on the flagstones next to him. He lowered his head onto the stones beside her. No, she said honestly, but it's something. He considered this. Then his markings settled back to gold, and he closed his eyes, and she sat with him while the Geneva evening came down cool over the lake, and the assembly building stood old and quiet behind them, already changed by the day. The inquiry needed coordinates, and nobody had them. The Aetheri High Council claimed the location of the remaining Oranthos Verath was unknown. This was a lie of such practiced confidence that it took 3 weeks of internal document review for the inquiry investigators to formally establish that it was a lie rather than an error. The difference mattered legally. It took time they did not have. Sol had the answer. He could not give coordinates. He had never been to the hidden world. He had hatched on a fringe moon, in a stolen egg, in a war nobody had officially named. But he carried the direction in him the way deep ocean birds carry north, not as knowledge as bone. He showed Dara not in words but in sensation, a pull, a lane, an orientation. He was always facing the same way when he was still. Dara brought this to Orvath. The general sat across from her for a long time without speaking. He had that look he got when he was calculating how many regulations something would violate and deciding whether he cared. "If I authorize a survey mission," he said carefully, "based on a dragon's directional instinct, using a human vessel to a location not on any official chart, without assembly approval." "You didn't authorize it," Dara said. "You approved a xenobiological survey mission to the unmapped fringe sectors. The course deviation was due to navigational anomalies." Orvath looked at her. "I'm not writing that report." "I know." He picked up his pen. He signed the survey approval. He did not look at her again as she left. The vessel was small. A human survey ship called the Dara did not know its name because she had never paid attention to ship names, and she was not starting now. Wren called it the Little Disaster, which stuck. It carried 6 crew, 1 consul, 1 archivist, and 1 gold dragon who had to be partially disassembled and reassembled through the cargo loading hatch because he no longer fit through the standard entry. He was patient about this in a way that suggested he found it slightly undignified. The journey took 11 days. Sen talked during most of it. He was a man who had spent 40 years with information that nobody wanted to hear, and now someone was listening, and he was not going to waste the chance. He talked about the original records, the ones that had not been fully altered, the ones buried in research databases so old that the indexing system could barely find them. He talked about what the Oranthos Verath had been before the Declaration. Not animals, not weapons, not any of the things the High Council's redacted files had eventually reduced them to. Something more like neighbors. Long-lived, territorial, deeply invested in the places they called home. Not aggressive unless cornered. Very good at being cornered, historically. Sol listened. Dara could feel him listening, a particular stillness that meant full attention. She told him as much as she thought he understood. She thought he understood all of it. On the 9th day, he moved. He shifted his position in the cargo bay, stood up as fully as the ceiling allowed, and oriented himself with an attention that was different from his usual awareness. He pressed his nose to the forward bulkhead, and his markings shifted, slow, deep, the warm gold turning to something with more amber in it, something older. Dara told the navigator. The navigator adjusted course by 11 degrees. On the 11th day, they found the world. No name, no marker, just a planet that the charts showed as empty space, literally blank, not uncharted, but erased. It was warm, geologically active, covered in the mineral formations that held heat, a world that looked, from orbit, like something had been designed to be comfortable for something very large and very old. And it was not empty. They were in high orbit when the first one appeared, then 3 more, then, rising slowly from below the cloud layer, too many to count quickly. Dragons, dozens of them, every size, every shade of gold and amber and warm bronze and deep copper. Some so large they made Sol look small, which was difficult to process since Sol was now roughly the size of a city bus. The vessel went very quiet. Ilratha, standing at the observation window, said nothing. His 4 arms crossed over his chest, slowly, and he stood there with the look of a man who has just discovered a debt he does not know how to repay. Wren said, "Oh." The dragons held their altitude. They were looking at the ship. They were specifically looking at Sol, visible in the cargo bay window, his markings blazing gold bright. And then the largest one came up. She was vast and amber white, the color of old sunlight, and she moved through the upper atmosphere like weather. She came alongside the vessel at a careful distance and held there, wings spread, and she looked at Sol through the cargo window for a long time. Sol pressed himself against the glass. What happened next, the crew could not fully describe afterward. It was not sound, it was not visible. Sen later wrote that it was like watching a conversation in a language that was older than any language he had ever studied, conducted entirely in stillness. The old dragon turned her head. She looked directly and deliberately at Dara. Dara felt it land somewhere behind her sternum, not from Sol this time, directly, ancient and immense and perfectly clear, like a bell struck once. You carried our future out of the fire. Dara's eyes went wet. She did not try to stop them. Beside her, Ren made a small sound and turned to look out a different window. His shoulders were very tense in the specific way of someone who is also crying and hopping nobody notices. Sen sat down in the nearest seat slowly and put his face in his hands. Ilrith was still. His expression was not one Dara had seen on him before. It was not guilt. It was too old for guilt. It was something that had no name in either of their languages. Sol at the window had his eyes closed and his forehead resting against the glass. His markings were the deepest, warmest gold they had ever been. He was not going. He was not leaving. He was just finally seeing where he had come from. The survey ship transmitted its coordinates and visual record to the assembly inquiry 3 hours later. The blank space on the chart was no longer blank. The dragons were no longer extinct. And nobody, after that, was going to be able to pretend otherwise. The Aetheri High Council did not collapse. That would have been too clean, too much like the ending of a story. What happened instead was slower and more permanent. 3 senior council members resigned the same week the survey footage became public record. A reform faction within the Aetheri government, one that had existed quietly for decades, waiting for exactly this kind of documented, undeniable evidence, released a joint statement supporting the assembly inquiry and calling for a full review of the Extinction Declaration and the historical record. Consul Ilrith was not finished. He was elevated, quietly, without ceremony, by people who had been watching him from inside the system and had decided that the moment he stood up in that assembly chamber was the moment they had been holding space for. He sent Dara a message that said only, "It appears I still have a career." She wrote back, "Good." The Skithral operative who had stolen the egg was located in a border settlement trying to be someone else. The hearing took 4 months. It did not end with anything satisfying. It ended with the truth on the official record, which is a different thing from satisfaction, but lasts longer. Archivist Sen was asked to help draft the new legal framework for the Oranthos Verath's recognized species status. It was the first time in 400 years of assembly history that a species had been legally undeclared extinct. The existing framework had no category for it. Sen, who had spent 40 years preparing for a moment exactly like this, found the work energizing in a way that concerned his doctor and delighted him. Sol grew. He reached full adult size sometime in the 8th month after returning from the Dragon World, and nobody had a good reference point for what full adult size was supposed to be, so they measured him and wrote down the numbers and added them to the new species documentation. He was very large. He was very fast. He was also, as Ren once said in an interview that played everywhere, the most emotionally literate creature I have ever met, and I say that as someone who has known him since he was the size of a melon. He learned spoken language. Not all languages. Aetheri grammar gave him what Dara suspected was a principled objection rather than a linguistic difficulty. But human languages, several of them, with the deep patience of something that had inherited 300 years of waiting and had decided to use that capacity productively. His first complete spoken sentence in English was directed at Ren, who had just finished a very long explanation of why a particular local politician's press statement was actually quite clever. Sol had listened to the whole thing. Then he said, slowly and distinctly, "You talk too much." Ren's expression was the most betrayed Dara had ever seen a human face achieve. She laughed until her stomach hurt. Sol's markings went a brief, satisfied amber. He spent his time between Earth and the Dragon World, which had been given a formal name now, Verath's Rest, in the assembly records, though the dragons themselves called it something that translated roughly as home still. He was something new in the galaxy, a bridge. Not a symbol, not a representative, not a political object. A young dragon who had hatched in a burning building and been raised by humans and had two homes and was entirely at ease with that. The hearing at the assembly came 8 months after the survey footage. Dara was asked to give a statement on what she hoped would be the outcome. She thought about it for a moment. The room was full of delegates. There were cameras. The statement would be translated into 40 languages and transmitted to 12 inhabited systems. She said, "I just want them to be safe. The rest is paperwork." It was not in the official minutes. Someone on the translation team flagged it as too informal. But it was in every news transmission by the following morning in 40 languages, accompanied by the footage of Sol sitting in the Geneva courtyard with a child's hand resting near his jaw and his markings soft and gold in the evening light. The paperwork, as it happened, took years. Most important things do. On a clear evening about a year after the depot, Dara and Sol were above the clouds. She was on his back, something that had happened so gradually she couldn't remember the exact first time, some quiet morning when he had crouched in the facility yard and looked at her with an expression that clearly meant well, and she had climbed up and held on. Now it was ordinary. Now it was just where she sometimes was. Below them, Earth was small and lit and whole. Above them, the stars were very large and very close. Sol flew in the specific, easy way he had when he was not going anywhere in particular, just going. She felt from him a kind of quiet that was different from peace. Peace was the absence of something. This was the presence of something warm and steady and old. He spoke in English because she was who he was talking to. "Was this what you intended?" She thought about it, the depot, the smoke, the pulse of the egg against her palms in the dark, Ren saying how heavy before he had even seen what he was carrying. "No," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The cold air moved past them. "I just couldn't leave the egg," she said. Sol considered this, his markings held steady. "I know," he said, "that is why." She did not ask why what. She thought she understood. The war had no name. The peace had 40, depending on who you asked. The egg had never been meant to survive the depot fire. But there had been a human in that basement, and she had looked at something warm and alive and in danger, and she had done the thing that humans do, not because she was certain, not because she understood, not because she had a plan. Just because it was there, and it needed someone, and she was that someone. The rest, as it turned out, was history. The kind nobody would ever be allowed to forget again.